It was January 1942. The Pacific Ocean, a vast and indifferent arena, had become the crucible of a global war. In the desperate weeks following Pearl Harbor, Axis forces advanced across multiple fronts. The United States Navy was pushed to its limits. The loss of the aircraft carrier Saratoga left the USS Enterprise as the sole available behemoth. It was part of Task Force 8. This was a stark symbol of America's precarious position. It also highlighted the immense risks inherent in every mission. This was an era of primitive naval aviation. Navigation often relied on dead reckoning. Radar systems like the CXSAM could only detect large formations up to 80 miles. Radios were notoriously unreliable. They offered either short-range VHF or temperamental long-range Morse code. Survival gear, too, was frighteningly basic. It was into this challenging environment that Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Harold F. Dixon prepared for a routine patrol. He was a naval aviation pilot. With him were aviation ordnanceman Second Class Anthony J. Pastula, the bomber, and aviation radioman Third Class Gene D. Aldrich, the gunner. Before his final flight on January 16, 1942, Dixon felt an unsettling premonition. He was a man accustomed to the constant threat of danger. He ate a substantial meal, knowing it might be his last for days. He exercised vigorously. This habit was honed by a job where severe injuries to shipmates were a grim reality. Amidst the looming dread, a small human detail emerged. Dixon quietly tucked 2 extra stalks of celery into his flight gear. It was a simple comfort against the unknown. Their TBD Devastator aircraft 6-6 lifted off the Enterprise's flight deck. The broad, bright expanse of the carrier fell away. The bomber ascended into a sharp blue sky dotted with scattered clouds. The flight itself was a dull afternoon. It was uneventful in terms of enemy sightings. Yet a mounting anxiety settled over the crew. Before takeoff, the pre-flight briefing had revealed inaccurate wind data. This was a critical flaw that complicated their navigation from the outset. Despite diligent cross-checking of calculations, the mission proceeded. Attempts to establish radio contact with the ship using their primitive Matox receiver failed repeatedly. Variable winds silently altered their course. The crew became hopelessly lost. As the fuel gauge dipped to a terrifying 10 gallons, the pilot, Dixon, knew he had no recourse left. It was an afternoon approximately 1,900 miles southwest of Hawaii. They were south of the equator. The decision was made for a water landing. The low-wing single-engine torpedo bomber was a land aircraft. It was never designed to float. It struck the surface of the sea with a sound like the slap of a giant hand on the water. A great splash momentarily blinded Dixon. The sea had appeared flat and solid from the air. It instantly transformed into a reaching, greedy thing. It shook its prey before devouring it. For a brief, surreal moment, the plane bobbed gently. Then, like a magician's trick, it swiftly disappeared beneath the waves. It left only a tiny whirlpool to mark its grave. Most of their essential equipment went with it. The 3 airmen found themselves floundering in their life jackets. The sea was banging Dixon in the face. It was filling his mouth with salt water. None of them could swim. Dixon, the pilot, felt himself strangling in the salt water. He was swallowing great quantities of sea. He wrestled desperately with the rubber life raft. Tony Pastula and Gene Aldrich struggled alongside him. In the chaos, as the carbon dioxide flask inflated the raft, Aldrich accidentally dropped the chartboard and flashlights. They spiraled down like a luminous fish into the depths. Tony, with incredible presence of mind, managed to save his .45 automatic pistol. Their initial survival hinged on the few items in their pockets. These included a pocket knife, a pair of pliers, a few rags, and a length of line. Their 8-by-4-foot raft, meant to be their salvation, had inflated upside down. This was due to a malfunctioning valve. As they struggled to right it, the constant threat of it flipping over was palpable. Dixon, ever the leader, quipped, "Hey, take it easy there. We've still got plenty of time to drown." Gene Aldrich, exhibiting a calm practicality akin to working on a recalcitrant mowing machine, suggested, "There's a way to get this thing over." Tony Pastula devised a plan. They would remove their blouses, tie them together, and use them with a line to flip the raft. "You stay here and hold her down," Dixon instructed, "while I get aboard on the other side." This collaborative effort succeeded. It allowed them to finally clamber inside the cramped 80 by 40-inch interior. It was a space so small, it made it impossible for 3 men to dispose this space so that any one of us would be comfortable. Despite the grim circumstances, Dixon reflected that it was swell to be alive. It was a testament to their immediate, albeit temporary, victory. But the immediate shock of the crash soon gave way to the brutal physical torment of the sea. Once aboard, the crew faced a grim reality. Essential survival gear, including oars and a pump, were missing. The lost air pump was a constant source of anxiety. Any leak would be irreparable. One of their life jackets already leaked, failing to hold air. Their small, orange-yellow 40-pound raft was not much bigger than the inside of a bathtub. It left them crowded and vulnerable. The first night was a waking night. The raft bobbled like a cork. It endured a terrific pounding from waves that felt like sharp explosions. They were jarring blows across the shoulders. Their garments, stiff with salt, were clammy and cold. This forced them to huddle together to conserve precious bodily heat. Stranded, injured, and without the means to propel or repair their fragile vessel, their isolation and vulnerability were terrifyingly absolute. Adrift in the vast, indifferent Pacific, the 3 men faced a brutal test of will. Chief Dixon, Tony Pustula, and Gene Aldrich found their temporary reprieve inside the cramped raft quickly replaced by torment. The sun, a malevolent brass ball, beat down with merciless intensity. Its rays were like red-hot corkscrews that threatened to cook their brains. The ocean's surface became a blinding blue glare of heat. Every touch of the rubber raft was unbearable. Every breath was a struggle against the searing air. Yet, as oppressive as the physical torment was, the psychological burden weighed just as heavily. They were hundreds of miles from any land. The constant, gnawing fear of Japanese occupation on nearby islands amplified their terror. They held no illusions as to what would happen if they were discovered by enemy forces. Their immediate survival had hinged on Dixon's decisive action. He righted the capsized raft and hauled them aboard. It was a victory that felt monumental in its moment, but it now merely marked the beginning of an unknown ordeal. Hope for a swift rescue, however, was still a fragile, precious thing. As the misty dawn of their second day broke, their eyes scanned the horizon. They were already strained from the glare. They scanned with desperate intensity. Then, a speck appeared on the vast canvas of sky. It was a search plane. A beacon of fleeting salvation, its distant drone promised an end to their nightmare. Frantically, they waved, shouted, and tried to signal. Their hearts pounded with a renewed, almost unbearable hope. But the plane, a distant, indifferent silhouette, flew past. Its motors dwindled like the last note of a dirge. The sound faded. It left behind a silence more profound and terrifying than before. "Boys," Dixon recalled Tony's bitter remark, "there goes our one and only chance." A flicker of denial remained. Shucks, maybe he saw us and is going back for help, they thought. But the crushing reality forced them to confront a grim truth. They were terribly alone in the immensity of sky and sea and sun. Rescue was not imminent. This stark realization plunged them into a new phase of survival. The watches on their wrists, corroded by salt water, had all stopped at 7:40. It was a symbolic severing of their connection to time. Dixon, as the most experienced, quickly asserted leadership. He established a command structure where his word was law. It was a necessary discipline in their deteriorating circumstances. A watch system was put in place, though physical exhaustion would soon make sustained vigilance a near impossibility. In the face of overwhelming odds, stripped of their illusions of immediate rescue, one of the men quietly suggested it might be a good idea to say a prayer. He was not meeting their eyes. This simple act marked a profound shift. It was a collective surrender to a higher power, passing their burden to someone bigger than they. It instilled a fragile sense of shared purpose and spiritual comfort. The days that followed were a testament to human agency in the face of absolute deprivation. The initial hours brought maddening hunger. The sight of albatrosses and terns banqueting liberally all day long from this unfriendly sea only whetted their appetites. It made them angry with themselves that they were helpless to obtain food. Dixon, ever the pragmatist, attempted to shoot birds with Tony's .45 pistol. He hoped for sustenance, but the raft bobbled like a cork. It threw off his aim with every wave. After firing a whole clip and merely knocking feathers from a few, he gave up. He recognized the futility. Undeterred, their ingenuity turned to fishing. Despite missing proper gear, they improvised. Jean, with a calm practicality akin to working on a recalcitrant mowing machine, took the lead. He tied bait to a 3-strand cotton cord with a wire leader. Dixon, attempting to fashion a hook, broke his pliers. The bolt holding them together had crystallized. Resourcefully, he used the broken pliers and a flat metal identification disc as sinkers. Hours passed, however, with fruitless waiting. Their improvised bait was lost. The small sharks were always present. They were a constant, unsettling shadow near the raft. They only deepened their frustration. But the defining moment of their early struggle against passive victimhood arrived with the invention of the sea anchor. Dixon devised a crude but brilliant solution. He used a leaking life jacket and a 20-foot length of heavy manila rope from the raft's lifeline. The tiny craft jerked, slowed, and swung about lazily. It pointed her bow into the wind. This cut their rate of drift to practically zero. It left a stubby wake. The raft had previously been tossed about. It now rode the waves like a veteran ocean-going steamer. The successful deployment of this makeshift anchor gave them a profound sense of agency. Tony exclaimed, "Perfect, despite a recent drenching." They felt more the masters of their fate. It was a powerful assertion of human will against the brutal indifference of the ocean. It was a quiet, defiant challenge to the notion that their survival was solely a matter of luck. The relentless ocean, an adversary of indifferent magnitude, continued its assault. It pushed the 3 airmen to the very precipice of human endurance. Thirst and hunger were no longer mere sensations. They had become constant, tormenting companions. They gnawed at their shrunken stomachs. They dried their throats to parched parchment. Their bodies, chafing under a perpetual rime of salt, were a testament to the corrosive environment. Every waking moment was a battle against the insistent demands of their failing physiology. It was a desperate, silent negotiation with the primal urge to survive. The first rainfall had been a moment of divine intervention. It was a deluge of sweet water that they had frantically collected in rags and an oar pocket. But the initial, almost childlike belief that prayer alone would suffice quickly gave way. It gave way to the stark reality that even the sweetest water still needed to be caught. It had to be rinsed of salt and rationed with meticulous care. God might send the rain, but human ingenuity and effort were required to turn it into life. The brief triumph of catching the first fish, a meager but vital morsel, offered a fleeting taste of sustenance. Yet this small victory was soon overshadowed by a grim lesson in survival. The albatross, that majestic monarch of the air, and the fish, when caught, began to glow. They glowed with an eerie phosphorescence in the dark. It was a clear signal of spoilage. The agonizing decision to heave their precious, hard-won food back into the indifferent sea was brutal. It was a stripping away of any romanticized notions of nature. It replaced them with the harsh practicalities of life and death. The raft itself, a flimsy rubber tub, was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Seared by day and frozen by night, their existence was a continuous physical assault. The drum-tight sides offered little respite from the quivering heat of the sun. They offered little respite from the biting cold of the equatorial night. Every touch of the rubber was either searing or chilling. The constant awareness of the vast, indifferent ocean surrounding their tiny vessel instilled a low, persistent dread. It allowed for no true rest. Their bodies were a battleground. Their skin was a map of suffering. The pervasive salt clinging to everything necessitated a constant, losing battle against dehydration. Their lips, particularly Tony's, never healed. They were constantly raw, bleeding, and reburned. A raw red circle on the narrator's wrist mirrored the ceaseless irritation. Even when rain fell, the salt on their skin and clothes drew moisture away. It was a cruel physiological trick that intensified their thirst rather than alleviating it. The immediate, violent dangers of their environment were undeniable. Jean's agonized yell as a shark bit his hand was a stark reminder. It showed how quickly their fragile existence could be shattered. It underscored the desperate need for medical attention that was simply unavailable. The psychological toll was equally profound. Isolation and deprivation bred a pervasive, dismal outlook. It led to morose silences and a scarcity of smiles. Shortness of temper and irrational outbursts became common. The narrator's sudden rage at Jean's absent-minded staring was one example. These outbursts were quickly suppressed. Jean would often wander in his thoughts. He reminisced about peach trees in Missouri. His mind sought escape from the unchanging horizon. Nightmares, vivid and horrifying, continued the torture. Dreams of the boat sinking or being cooked alive blended seamlessly into their waking reality. To combat this encroaching despair, they clung to mental anchors. They shared the ritual of charting their estimated progress. The narrator gave navigation lessons using Polaris and the Southern Cross. They found familiar comfort in storytelling. This included biblical parables, the elaborate charade of putting on the pot for coffee, and fond, food-filled fantasies. These acts of mental fortitude, humor, and shared purpose were the fragile threads that held their sanity together. Then came the hurricane. It was a violent storm that did not merely pass but stripped them bare. It had capsized the raft, throwing them into the boiling sea. The desperate struggle to right their vessel and haul themselves back aboard left them sore in every bone and muscle. But the true horror was the aftermath. It was the loss of critical gear, their sea anchor, their chart, the oar pocket, the narrator's pocket knife, pliers, a head covering, and their last rag were all gone. They were swallowed by the raging sea. They were left naked and exposed in the cold. They were shivering, disheartened, and perpetually sore. Their muscles were stiff and circulation poor. With the sea anchor, their last vestige of control over their direction was gone. It left them truly at the mercy of the currents. The gradual loss of strength became terrifyingly real. The narrator began losing feeling in his feet and legs. A partial paralysis slowly ascended to his hips. It made his once strong limbs feel alien, heavy, and unresponsive. Their mental acuity, too, deteriorated. Their minds grew dull. It made even simple conversation a physical effort. With their strength ebbing rapidly and their bodies almost without flesh, starved and sluggish blood circulated poorly. This exacerbated their vulnerability to every element. The lines between reality and delusion began to blur. Tony started to hear music, like a choir of angels. Jean saw a beautiful field of corn. These hallucinations marked a critical, terrifying point in their mental decline. It was a stark refutation of any romanticized notion of survival. It revealed the brutal truth of minds breaking under unbearable pressure. Amidst this deterioration, a chilling, pragmatic discussion arose. The narrator posed the question, suppose one of us starves to death, of course one of us would go first. What should we do with the body? This unspoken agreement on cannibalism was never acted upon, but it grounded the narrative in grim necessity. It was a stark revelation of the primal, unyielding will to live that lurked beneath their humanity. It demanded survival at any cost. The ocean, which for weeks had been a vast, indifferent tomb, now began to whisper promises of life. Flotsam, once a mere curiosity, became a compass point for their dwindling hope. The occasional coconut stem paddle, then larger pieces of driftwood, confirmed what their straining eyes had dared to believe. Land was near. Marine life, too, grew more abundant. Birds, no longer solitary specks, now flew in purposeful patterns. Fish broke the surface with a frequency that suggested teeming lagoons, not endless deeps. Each sign, no matter how small, was a jolt of adrenaline to their emaciated bodies. A dead calm had forced them to improvise shoe paddles days earlier. It was a desperate, almost absurd effort. Against all odds, it had given them a fleeting sense of control. Now, that same ingenuity was channeled into a final agonizing push. They forced their unresponsive limbs to churn the water. They were propelled by a desperate primal urge. But even as the signs multiplied, a cruel reality surfaced. Their carefully maintained chart, a fragile anchor in their mental storm, revealed a devastating miscalculation. They were still 100 miles east of where they believed a large, inhabited island should be. Hope, which had flared so brightly, threatened to extinguish once more. It left them to cling desperately to their tiny raft, and to their spirits. The reef-laced horizon loomed with both salvation and peril. Then the final, incredible surge. After 34 days, Puka Puka Atoll emerged from the shimmering haze. It was a verdant miracle. The journey across the reef had been a tumultuous gauntlet of towering waves. It flipped their raft and scattered them into the churning sea. Locals would later deem their passage impossible. It was a testament to the sheer desperate luck and timing that had carried them through. But even on solid ground, their ordeal continued. Their legs, so long doubled in the cramped raft, refused to bear their weight. Dizzy from exhaustion, with the whole world seemingly spinning, they crawled onto the beach. Their bodies were screaming in protest. They dragged the deflated rubber shell to a cluster of rotting poles. Shelter came in the form of a taboo shack. It was a derelict structure that offered a fragile sense of security. The next morning brought the apprehension of a first encounter with a native. After initial wary glances, he signaled for help. Soon the resident commissioner arrived. His face was a mixture of disbelief and wonder. He led them to his sturdy house, built high above the sea. He was still shaking his head at their impossible crossing of the reef. Their first real meal and hot coffee, prepared by his wife, were a balm to their ravaged bodies, though caution was needed against overeating. Amidst the recovery and the initial profound relief, a new frustration simmered. Days had passed on the island. Still, no word had reached the outside world. The narrator, restless and desperate for relief, discovered the island possessed a small radio transmitter. "Radioed what?" he exclaimed. "I had been almost a week on the island and didn't know there was a radio." The words burst forth in a mix of incredulity and urgency. He sought out the trained native radio operator. After sharing an honest-to-goodness civilized smoke, the man understood the depth of their plight. As the operator's practiced fingers tapped out their distress call, a wave of dawning hope washed over the survivors. The languid South Sea air had for so long carried only the sounds of waves and wind. It now got a message to carry in a hurry. It was a lifeline thrown across 1,000 miles of ocean. The successful transmission, confirmed by the commissioner, brought a profound, almost dizzying relief. It cemented the knowledge that they were, truly, not to die. Their time on Puka Puka, however, quickly became a shared struggle. Just a day after their arrival, a devastating hurricane tore through the atoll. It obliterated homes and food sources. It left the islanders facing famine. The war, raging across the Pacific, meant resupply ships were scarce. This exacerbated their plight. Yet, despite their own severe privation, the islanders met the survivors with immense generosity. They shared what little they had. This shared ordeal, the storm-lashed nights spent huddled together, forged an unexpected bond. It was a bond of gratitude and respect between the American airmen and the resilient people of Puka Puka. 7 days after their arrival on the island, a new shape appeared on the horizon. It was a morning that dawned clear and bright. A smudge of grey, growing steadily larger, resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of an American warship. The USS Swan, AVP-7, a seaplane tender, had arrived. The sight of it was a tangible symbol of the world they had feared, lost forever. It was an overwhelming emotional release. Tears welled, voices cracked. A profound, silent gratitude filled the air. It was over. The rescue itself was swift and efficient. Dixon, Pastula, and Aldrich, fragile and emaciated, were carefully transferred from the small boat to the warship. They were then transported to American Samoa for urgent recovery from malnutrition and severe sunburn. Their dispossession was absolute. It was a stark testament to the ordeal they had endured. A Bull Durham sack would have been sufficient to hold everything they owned, the narrator would later recall. It was a poignant image of how 34 days adrift had stripped away all but the raw essence of their lives. They had lost everything material, but they gained an unbreakable bond. They gained an unshakable understanding of the power of human will. They gained a story that would forever stand as a beacon of endurance. The USS Swan had delivered salvation. But the end of their ordeal at sea was merely the beginning of another, more profound journey. Dixon, Pastula, and Aldrich, fragile and emaciated, were carefully transported to American Samoa. Their bodies, once maps of raw red circles and peeling skin, slowly began to heal. They healed from the severe sunburn and deep malnutrition. Their legs, so long doubled in the cramped raft, had frozen into the sitting position. They refused to straighten for weeks. Every movement was a struggle. Their skinned backs and cooked hips kept them in constant torment for many days. It forced them to relearn the simplest act of balancing themselves. Yet, with each passing day, their extraordinary resilience shone through. It was a testament to the human body's capacity to mend. Back on Puka Puka, the commissioner's gratitude was unbounded. It was a sentiment echoed by every islander. Despite their own homes being obliterated and food sources destroyed by the recent hurricane, the people of Puka Puka had met the survivors with immense generosity. They gathered in great swarms to watch them eat. They offered what little they had. One native, having lost his own home and garden, still wove a hat and gathered food for the shipwrecked airmen. A woman watched them eat for 3 days without a let-up. It was a silent vigil of shared humanity that forged an unbreakable bond. The return to military life, however, brought its own complexities. A debriefing and award ceremony followed. It was a stark contrast to the shared, raw struggle for survival. Chief Dixon, as the senior officer, received the Navy Cross. Tony Pustula and Gene Aldrich, his equally courageous and enduring companions, received commendations. This disparity in recognition, despite their shared ordeal and mutual reliance, subtly underscored the hierarchical nature of military awards. Leadership and rank often outweighed the collective heroism of those who suffered equally. It challenged the romanticized notion of inherent heroism. It suggested that even in the crucible of survival, external structures dictated who received the highest accolades. Their dispossession was absolute. It was a stark testament to the ordeal they had endured. A Bull Durham sack would have been sufficient to hold everything they owned, the narrator would later recall. It was a poignant image of how 34 days adrift had stripped away all but the raw essence of their lives. The experience, however, left an indelible mark far beyond official recognition. The profound psychological impact of prolonged isolation and shared trauma forged deep bonds. These bonds would resonate throughout their subsequent lives. Tony Pustula married in 1942. He welcomed his first child, Jean Anthony, exactly 2 years after the ditching. This was on January 16, 1944. The name was appropriately chosen to honor the 2 men who had become closer than brothers. Gene Aldrich, in turn, married Tony's sister, Frances, in April 1945. This intertwined their families forever. Chief Dixon, who later retired as a lieutenant, even settled on Albatross Street in San Diego. It was a quiet nod to the majestic, ominous birds that had shared their endless ocean. In 1974, Tony Pustula, still moved by the memory, visited the USA Naval Academy Museum. He went to see their preserved raft. Later that same year, fulfilling a promise made during his rescue, Tony and his wife booked passage to the Cook Islands. They returned to the lovely, generous place of Puka Puka Atoll. The reunion with the islanders was a deeply moving moment. It included Sir Albert Henry, son of the original commissioner and now premier of the Cook Islands. It was a powerful testament to the enduring impact of human kindness and shared humanity across cultures. The harrowing experiences of these survivors, and countless others like them, were not merely individual sagas. They became catalysts for monumental change. The primitive navigation, unreliable communications, and basic survival gear of 1942 were brutally exposed by their ordeal. From their suffering rose a new era of technological advancement. Aircraft navigation systems evolved dramatically. They went from dead reckoning to sophisticated LRAN and TACAN. Radar capabilities, once limited to 80 miles, became highly accurate and long-range. Crucially, search and rescue, or SAR, systems were revolutionized. The Gibson Girl hand-cranked radio emerged. Handheld VHF and UHF transceivers for two-way communication also developed. Later, satellite-based EPIRBs and ELTs with encoded owner information came into use. These emerged directly from the lessons learned in that vast, empty Pacific. What was once a tiny orange-yellow 40-pound raft, adrift and unheard, transformed into a powerful symbol. It drove the development of technologies designed to ensure no one would ever be so terribly alone in the immensity of sky and sea, and sun again. Ultimately, their narrative serves as a powerful testament to human will and adaptation. It implicitly critiques the primitive state of naval aviation technology and survival gear at the war's outset. It also celebrates human ingenuity and determination. Their story, by being told, provides an enduring inspiration and a vital historical record. It reminds us that even when basic equipment is missing and the odds are overwhelmingly stacked against them, the human will to survive can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. It debunks the idea that survival is solely dependent on luck or external aid. It stresses the paramount importance of internal fortitude and proactive actions. Early survival gear, like shark repellent dye, often proved to be more psychologically effective than practically useful. But the core truth remained. The tremendous human resources of mind and heart are still there. They have only to be used. Dixon, Pastula, and Aldrich proved that, even in the most desolate corners of the world, the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, will find a way to endure. It will adapt, and ultimately it will inspire.